right now. Go ahead.
Great. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. My name is John Sharp, but everybody calls me Pud. I'm the Assistant Director for Research at the Center for Louisiana Studies here upstairs for now in the Garland Dupre Library in Suite 313. Feel free, please come by and visit. I wanted to give a thank you before we get going, and I introduce Trey to the Student Center for Research, Creativity, and Scholarship, where we're having this presentation today, and also to the Advanced Student Research Experience, which is also part of this funding this organization. And thanks also to Dr. Sherry Krajewski for helping this come together. So welcome to the inaugural scholarship presentation of research from the Martin Family Undergraduate Research Assistantship. This assistantship was created to allow a student the opportunity to pursue research focused on culture and history of the Acadiana region, notably early colonial history and culture of Acadians, Africans, Native Americans, and free people of color. An extra special thanks today go to Bob and Judy Martin for their generous support in funding and establishing this assistantship, which, as I said, enables a student to do a deep dive on an area of their own interest while being supported financially, and also being given a base of operations through the Center for Louisiana Studies. So it's my pleasure to introduce the inaugural recipient of the Martin Family Research Assistantship, Trevian Ambrose, who we all call Trey. Trey's a senior history major from St. Martinville / Broussard. Had a little conversation about that beforehand, be sure. To say that Trey is a very busy young man and involved in campus and community activities is a huge understatement. We're excited to see this culmination of the information he's been able to gather over this semester, and we've been seeing we get to talk about it on a regular basis, so I feel lucky in that regard. But I know he's going to have some surprises for us today as well. So with no further delay, Trey.
Thank you.
Sure. No, it's okay.
All right, everybody. Thank you once again for coming to my conversation today. I'm Trey Ambrose, and thank you, Pud, for that introduction. And so before we begin, I really want to start off with acknowledgements, which is, of course, about meaning and gratitude. Special thanks to those responsible for the Martin Family Fellowship and my peers at the Center for Louisiana Studies. Thanks to Dr. P.B. Hayes of the Iberia African American Historical Society, Ann Dara and Tammy LeBlanc of the Little Brooklyn Neighborhood Initiative, and Julie Bauer of the Iberia Parish Public Library for conversation and collaboration. Additional thanks, of course, goes to the Center for Louisiana Studies and the Student Center for Research, Creativity, and Scholarship for sponsoring today's conversation. Additionally, since we are speaking about land and land use, it is only an honor to portray this acknowledgement of the land, specifically here in Lafayette, being that we're here in Lafayette, to the Attakapo Nation. And additionally, since we're talking about Iberia, in New Iberia, the Chitimacha Nation, and additionally paying honor and respect to their elders of the past, of the present, and of course, future Native identity as well. Additionally, since we are speaking about African American history and African American communities, I really would like to pay acknowledgement to the enslaved West Africans and West Central Africans who lived and labored on these sites and in these places on enslaved plantation complexes in regards of paying respect to their ancestors, and additionally of the present and their descendants of the present and of the future as well. And so our frame is very essential in thinking about how in which ways revisualizing happens and also understanding the geographies of emancipation. And so the geography of emancipation, in a way in which I defined it, is that it's established in the decades following the Civil War, and the spatialization of Black communities or neighborhoods in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, reveals the connections of the lived experience in emancipation juxtaposed to the urbanization of exclusion. And that is to say that in my frame of understanding emancipation, it's in how in which ways emancipation is not just simply an act or a status, but rather an era. And of course, that essential question is, when does emancipation begin? So for some individuals, emancipation begins in regards of self-emancipating or self-liberating before 1863, actually going out and fleeing to and receiving and getting their emancipation liberation by their own hands. Additionally, other forms of emancipation exist in regards of manumission, but in regards of this context of what I'm speaking about, and additionally how I'm using emancipation in this time, in this context, it refers to an era, particularly in Ivory Parish, established in 1863, when African Americans and enslaved Africans and African Americans self-emancipated themselves by joining the Union contraband camps and fleeing for their lives in regards of joining, but once again, how much ways liberation and emancipation was received. And additionally, emancipation in this context is not as I said, a year-long endeavor. It's not a generation, it's actually a continuous process of which we're living in still today. And so additionally, how much ways we view Black geography. So this is a conversation, an interview actually of Catherine McKittrick discussing to Hudson. By beautiful, I mean referring to the discussion of Black placemaking in regards of how much ways her thoughts of Black geography, her relationship in Canada actually relates to the overall understanding and thinking about Black diasporic identities being reflected in the geography. By beautiful, I mean pleasing and delicate and dazzling and brilliant, even if it is putting forth a sense of place that is wrapped in awfulness. And I thought, yes, the long history of Black dispossession and violence, this world, that world, a world not only covets the idea of ownership and racial subjection, but rewards practices of capital accumulation, which is also a world where Black is always owned and unowned, necessarily informs a Black sense of place. And so in this thought, Black geography is not simply about how in which ways African Americans responded to the urbanization of exclusion, that is to say the urbanization of apartheid or Jim Crow. To say that or to limit that frame of African Americans creating place, juxtapose that in regards of survival and how in which way survival was created. But not to limit that frame, I expand upon how much ways Black geography is created in regards of imagination, or how in which ways Black community development came forward in regards of providing the needs, the resources for the community and the people living in those communities as well. And additionally, thinking about on race and space, or racialization of spaces and the spatialization of race. The lived experience of race has a spatial dimension, and the lived experience of space has a racial dimension. People of different races in the United States are relegated to the different physical locations by housing and lending discrimination, by school district boundaries, by policing practices, by zoning regulations, and by the design of transit systems. And the racial demographic of the places where people live, work, play, shop, and travel exposes them to socially shared systems of exclusion and inclusion. And that was said by George Lipset, in which he discusses the racialization of space and the spatialization of race, and how in which ways our communities are defined by those spaces. And one key thing that I really would like everyone to think about and really frame my discussions around: the socially shared systems of exclusion and inclusion, and how in which ways this is unfolded, in particular in the context of New Iberia, Louisiana. And so on Nueva Iberia, very much so the memories of the Queen City. If you're not from this area, New Iberia is designated as the Queen City of the Tesh. And so in this, the earliest memories of the Queen City, or the earliest idea of place, or the establishment of place, really comes from the earliest peoples to establish place along the waterway of the Bayou Teche, or contemporarily known as the Plaquemine peoples. contemporarily known. We do not know the name attached to these peoples, to these nations, but the Plaquemine derives from the idea or the understanding or the archaeological discussions of attaching the term Plaquemine to this particular culture. Migrated to the waters in 4000 BCE. Along the Teche, the Plaquemine peoples developed systems and settlements, conducted trade, and built continental networks, or established or connected in continental networks, and built large structures that served as mounds or religious and cultural spaces. Additionally, it's from that frame of understanding the creation of place in Liberia, the history of the site in Liberia is tied, of course, to the Bayou Teche and its forces which provided sustaining resources and cause of adaptation. Another way to think about it is that centuries later, the Upper Teche would be divided between the bands of the Tacoma Ishak people, or the Ishak people, and the Lower Teche would become the homelands of the Chitimacha people. Establishing the ways in which they built their settlements, their communities, their identities were reflected, and how in which ways they established settlements and networks securing the Lower Teche and the Upper Teche as well. And of course, these sites are still present with us. For example, Jenneret, Baldwin, Sheraton, and Patterson as well. The impact of settler colonialism, really reflecting on this, and the continuous intrusion into the Teche on the pre-colonial nations included the effects of disease, enslavement, violence, depopulation, and relocation. And it's from this lens of settler colonialism by the 1770s, much of the land of the west bank of the Teche that had become or will become known as Liberia were granted to French provosts of the Spanish government in Louisiana. 3 years later, provosts opted to subdivide and sell the land to several Malaguenos from a initial settlement known as Nueva Iberia near present-day Sheraton. And so the Malaguenos were Spanish settler colonists from the Malaguena part of Spain, which is directly near the north tip of Africa. And so they themselves were influenced by that connection to North Africa as well, and just the history of Spain in connection to North Africa as well. And so the story essentially goes of history, reveals or tells us that the first settlement that would become known as Nueva Iberia was actually established near present-day Sheraton. Eventually, a flood happened, as they do here in Louisiana, and it eventually destroyed that first settlement. So they essentially went up the Bayou Teche into what is now the present-day site of Liberia, or a false point, and actually established a new settlement. But additionally, it's important to note and discuss the history of enslavement that is tied to this settlement and this endeavor by the Spanish government. The earliest instance of being, and so among the settlers were enslaved West Africans who would become the early progenitors of Black communities in present-day Liberia. Forcibly laboring, these West Africans laid the early foundation for the new Iberia built environment, using their knowledge, constructing housing and agriculture buildings, planting crops of corn and rice, and transporting people and goods. It is additionally important to note that Bolognese, who was actually Francesco Bolognese, was responsible for this endeavor, settlement continued to grow, increasingly slow, and it was a costly frustration by the Spanish government in New Orleans, or Nouvelle Orleans at that time, until a war with England demanded Bolognese's departure. But moving from the settler colonialism into the idea of a crossroads town, or a town established in the crossroads before 1860. The US period would be marked by the early selling of land by the Malagueno families to the new influx of migrants. These new inhabitants joined alongside the descendants of the early Malaguenos in developing a racial slaveocracy that was sustained by a network of forced labor forms or complexes or plantations growing and processing crops like sugarcane. And so this nexus, or this point of intersection, would become known as New Iberia, or the town of Iberia. And so in this position, in regards to thinking about how much ways that settlement was developed, it ties commercial and transportational activity, but also thinking about how it was connected, a road that was essentially still Highway 31 that connected St. Martinville and Franklin, two other large hubs of the racial slaveocracy established in the Teche country. And so if we're looking at a map of New Iberia today, the old, or the original site of New Iberia is actually, is actually here. And so if that was to look at the map, it's a bend on the Bayou Teche. Essentially, this site was identified by Glenn Conrad sometimes in the 60s or the 70s, but identifying in regards of the curvature of the Teche and also in proximity to Hopkins Street, Jane Street, for that area right there. In regards of thinking about how the urban core was developed, this is actually the urban core of Liberia, still very much so the downtown of Liberia. And that was established sometime in the 1830s, late 1820s. But the reason why this was established here is actually a story that begins with the Stein landholding, which was a family. After the death of the patriarch of that family, the family ended up subdividing the land, and eventually that point would be the building up of that built environment. It's also very important to note that plantation complex was here in the Hopkins land holding, another plantation complex, the Superior land holding, another one in the Weeks land holding, and an additional fourth in the Miller-Lewis land holding. And so if you're going to put yourself in position to know Liberia today, Hopkins Street, Hopkins land holding, Center Street, which is the center of the Weeks family land holding, which is now the Shadows on the Teche, Miller-Lewis, Lewis Street, which is named after the individual who inherited the Miller property, and Superior Avenue, which is here, or if in other relationship, Mount Carmel Academy. Let's see, all right. And so finding spaces, how did I identify these spaces that we're going to discuss here very shortly? With the earliest known maps of this kind in Iberia Parish, dating back to 1885, the sandbar maps that depict the city of Iberia provide an essential overview of the time span of urban development within or near the city. And so if you're hearing the sandbar maps for the first time, they're a fire insurance mapping company that was established sometime in the 1860s, if I'm not mistaken. But in New Iberia, our first maps really come in the 1880s, mid-1880s and 1885. And essentially, this map provides very detailed account, but once again, from that frame or lens of fire insurance, protecting, thinking about regards of what type of structures were there, the detailed accounts of structures, and who also owned those structures. Additionally, the reason why I'm able to identify these spaces is principally because of the use of a racialized label in regards of color. And so the term colored and Negro are used in regards of property ownership and who is owning said property. And so, for example, the term Negro is used to describe or identify the race of occupants who are either owners and renters in these maps in residences from 1885 to 1899. We will see an example of that shortly. However, they continues to describe commercial public spaces by African Americans after this period. Additionally, by 1909, the term is no longer used to make a distinction towards commercial lots. Instead, it's used to describe institutional labels or spaces like schools and churches and society and benevolent halls or dance halls as well. Additionally, it's using the city directories published in the 1940s, which was also published by the State Directory Company in cooperation with the local newspaper, the Weekly Iberian, the Daily Iberian today. The New Iberia City Directory gives a detailed listing of location of spaces within the area called Greater New Iberia. The directory company also follows along the footsteps of the sandbar maps by using a C, which represents colored, to designate specifically Black-owned spaces within the city of New Iberia. And so it's through these two primary efforts, but by 1954, we received a new city directory, and that city directory is, of course, not using the term color to describe those spaces. So how did I define those spaces or find spaces? It's through an account published by Sandra Eaglin in an essay in Glenn Conrad's book on New Iberia's history that actually defines and specifies Black-owned spaces post-1950s. And so it's through a collaborative effort of viewing those maps, of viewing the city directory, and of reading Sandra Eaglin's essay that I'm able to identify these spaces. And so additionally, it's from this point we conclude or kind of think through the case studies, which I call viewing the maps essentially. And so the case studies following the pages will discuss and outline the development Black geographies of the course of the mid-1880s and into the 1950s. They included locations depicted in the accompanying maps, providing visualization of the geography of Black emancipation in New Iberia, as described in the Sanborn maps, city directories, and Sandra Eagle's essay, New Iberia Essays in the Town and Its People. Please note that spaces that could not be identified with an exact location are not included, and additional information, addresses that no longer exist or can be found on said maps, are addresses that were not included. And so with that, we begin our discussion on from the 1880s into the 1950s. And so circa 1880 to 1900, we see New Iberia primarily in its beginnings or origins in a sense of thinking about how much ways into the 1880s we're thinking about place. And so essentially the best way to really think about this is essentially thinking about first residential spaces are designated in green with the house. We have examples of tenement housing, which existed in St. Peter's Street and also existed here, which is kind of North Hopkins, excuse me, and additionally existing here near Bridge Street or Surrett Alley. This area of New Iberia, as it is still very much today, is the downtown area, or was a downtown area, very much so a dense place in regards of its relationship. Just to give everyone kind of an overview of this, the railroad was very much so established by this time. We also have the Bayou Teche, river or bayou transportation was somewhat in a decline. And so in this relationship, we have a built environment or a urban core, if you will, really established on this side of the Bayou Teche. And additionally, thinking about African-American placemaking, we have private or dwellings existing here on Dark Alley. This is the only example of private dwellings being used to describe African-American housing here in Liberia in the 1880s to 1900. Other than that, we have the term tenement, which is used to kind of designate a difference. And so in a way to think about tenement, you have in regards of renting or in regards of it being in those tenement conditions, while dwellings designated more so or kind of designate family use or single family units as well. Additionally, thinking about the participation of African Americans in Main Street, we have a cafe, a barber shop, and excuse me for that, but I will definitely give you those examples as soon as I can turn to my page right here. But a dance hall existing here on St. Jude Ave, and additionally identifying corridors is very essential to thinking about African American placemaking. And so the first corridor that I identified is the French Pershing corridor. Very much so still in existence today. But the reason why it's identified and still very much so identified today is because of the existence of St. Paul's Church, which is here, Howe Institute, which is located near, which is now the Iberia Parish Courthouse today. Douglas Institute, which was the all-Black high school, public high school in Liberia during this time, and a boarding house, if you will, on this street as well. And additionally, identifying placemaking through creation of institutional spaces. We have 4 churches that were established into the 1860s. And just to give you a detail, these 4 churches are Mount Calvary, excuse me, St. Paul's, as I said, St. James, and additionally, thinking about how in which ways those relationships and those spaces connected to those populations are spaces of institutional gathering, right, of worship, but also spaces to commune and communicate and how much ways they can continue to build their communities. And so additionally, thinking about this map, it's very essential to think about. You're seeing a lot of African-American participation in building of placemaking in various spaces in Liberia. So there isn't essentially a key forming or key core yet outside of the French Pershing corridor. Into the 1900s, into the 1920s, we see a different story. Essentially, by 1899, a great fire had destroyed much of the downtown area. And so essentially, this is all rebuilding, especially in this part of Liberia. Into these spaces, we will see the last of the participation of African Americans into the 1950s in this part of Main Street. And so we have a drugstore, a restaurant or cafe, and a salon or a bar, if you will. Identifying additional spaces, we have a French Persian corridor, which is of course continuing to develop. A female boarding house here, a female boarding house here. Additionally, thinking about we see the development of benevolent society halls being developed across New Iberia. Once again, other spaces to develop, other spaces to commune, cafes as well. And additionally, we see the first example of a Black-owned space on Hopkins Street, which would become the Weston Corridor. Here in the Lafayette Main Corridor, we also have those spaces designated of the dance halls or of those labor those labor movement areas or benevolent society halls as well. I also like to point very much to a discussion around the red light district in New Iberia that existed on Pershing Street. It existed, if to kind of put yourself in a position of place, existed very much so near the railroad track station, the railroad station or train station that was directly across the street. So thinking about how much ways the lives of these individuals who lived and worked in the red light district in New Iberia very much so tells those experiences, and is very much so essential to understanding the frame and the lives of the people living in this part of New Iberia, but also very much so around New Iberia as well. And so here you have the use of female boarding house, which is a designated term used by the Sanborn Map Company to essentially mean a brothel or bordello or other terms to describe spaces of where sex workers are working. Additionally, it's from this space we have the designation of the term Negro to describe specifically Black female boarding houses, but additionally, this area contained white female boarding houses as well. Now it's into the 1920s and 1940s, and then I spoke about how much ways the map has changed. The Sanborn maps no longer identify commercial spaces that are owned by African Americans. Instead, the Sanborn map very much relies on the designation of institutional spaces, churches, schools, graveyards. And so, for example, we have educational spaces that are established during this time. Here we have the Iberia Parish Training School, which was established first and foremost by African Americans purchasing the land in this area and then giving it to the parish public school system so that the Iberia Parish Training School could be established. By that time, Douglas Institute, which we discussed before, was in a state of disrepair, essentially, and a desire was to be building a newer, more modern campus in this part of New Iberia. We also have St. Edward's Convent School, which was established by the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, and also St. Edward's Church, which was established in 1917, if I'm not mistaken, which speaks about the experiences of Black Catholics, particularly in the spaces of racial apartheid within the other church in New Iberia. Additionally, we have a public school being built here or established here in the more east end of New Iberia. And this space is still, in regards to thinking about how much its relationship to, though it's not a school today and that space is no longer used as an educational space, but thinking about the before of this space, it was actually a white school that became a Black school when a new white school was built. And also thinking about what's happening in the West Ave area, an additional more spaces thinking about in regards of the city expanding in the West End and identifying the spaces or sacred spaces and benevolent society spaces in regards to institutions and building up communities and continuing that development in regards of how much ways people are identifying in the spaces they are congregating in. And of course, into the 1940s and 1960s, we see perhaps the largest expanse of Black community development in regards of thinking about how much ways this is also paralleling of what's happening in New Iberia in general and what's happening across the United States as well. This is the 1940s, so this is post-war America. Thinking about the relationship of the core during this time, the relationship of people moving and how much ways those spaces are interacting, what new industries are being brought into New Iberia, or what old industries are continuing, right? Sugarcane is very much so still alive and well during this time, and how much ways that relationship is reflected in regards of people identifying themselves. And so we essentially have very much so the Western corridor. I'll save that for our last point of discussion. But the spaces on the West Ave, as you can see, It's very much developing. We have another church being built, another church, a drugstore, grocery store, another grocery store, Jonas B. Henderson High School, which is established here, and additionally a barber shop. We have insurance brokers that are established across New Iberia, designating once again that space of how in which ways African Americans are being supported in regards of insurance. And additionally, we have Little Brooklyn corridor, which is here. Little Brooklyn was established in the late 1890s to the early 1900s, and is very much so an enclave, or established as an enclave for African Americans. Particularly thinking about how it was, the Superior Plantation Complex was here, but how in which ways the space was created. And so we have a cafe, another cafe, Benevolent Society Hall, and an insurance branch here as well. And so these insurance branches could have been offices, they could have been spaces where people operated within their own homes, but they were definitely designated as spaces within the city directorate. Additionally, thinking about the East End, you also have some development here, doctor's office, another benevolent society, dance hall, if you will, on this side as well. And so into the West End, which in some references it's called the block, in other references it's called the space, where of course you have everything that you need. References of individuals coming from all over the place, right, to New Iberia because of its proximity in its space, of people going to this part of Iberia because it's a space where they can see themselves in, a space where they essentially, in a sense, they can escape what apartheid essentially placed them in a position in regards to white-only spaces or white-centered spaces. And so essentially thinking about this area of New Iberia, we have, there's a lot, so I'll actually just give a brief summary of what was being developed here in New Iberia, in that part of New Iberia. We have Dr. E.L. Dorsey office in South Hopkins, Alexander Cafe, Washington Street. We also have Paradise Cafe, several restaurants in this section. Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is French and Robertson, so it would be this, it would be in this area right here. Max Cafe, which is Lafayette, so this is this area right there. Hamilton Drugstore, funeral homes, insurance, doctor's office, dentist offices, grocery stores. I mean, you listed essentially, I think, service station, ironing stations, spaces. I think about how much ways these spaces allow for or are engaged in regards to community placemaking and identity and spatialization of Black geographies, particularly during the 1940s and the 1960s. And so to conclude or close this conversation, it's very much so rooted in the fact that I am just a visitor in these conversations. These conversations and discussions have very much so been alive and well long before me in regards of identifying space and places. These spaces, though I am not someone who's from New Iberia, very much so is in relationship to the history and the stories of this region, and very much so expressions around the United States. And in regards to thinking about New Iberia as a place, we have that relationship to Lafayette, and thinking about the relationship or the establishment of Black placemaking happening in Lafayette, happening in Opelousas, happening in St. Martinville, happening in all of those areas of Black communities developing, and how much ways that's being reflected within the built environment. The Sanborn maps, city directories, they offer us small moments. They don't offer us the full picture. There are periods that are excluded, right? There are times and years that are forgotten, and you ask, what happened during this time? But it also offers us at least a detailed overview of that history, overview, if you will, that offers us an explanation to think about our own placement here today, or the spaces that we inhabit, spaces we identify and call, and how much way we belong in regards to the relationship here, and also in other conversations around the United States, and of course the world, definitely. And so, are there any other questions? My contact information is here. Before we go to questions, I would like to know that all of those images that you saw were actually images of New Iberia. They were specific areas that I spoke about, but they are from the Sanborn Fire Insurance Map from New Iberia, Iberia Parish, Louisiana Sanborn Map Company. They can be found digitally available through the Library of Congress. And additionally, some frames, of course, the New Iberia Essays on the Town and Its People, which is by Glenn Conrad, Hudson, Peter James, and Catherine Kittrick, and Lipset George, and how much ways they discuss land use and spatialization and Black geographies in their own professions, thinking about how much ways landscapes reveal history. And so going back to questions, are there any other questions, comments, suggestions that you have? Remember, this is a preliminary conversation. I hope to turn all of this data and wonderful information into a more digitally accessible mapping project that can be readily available for individuals to look at overview of history and development happening in Liberia, particularly from 1880 to 1950, which is a big span.
Can we applaud you first? This is amazing. Is there a moderator?
So you can see the chat, so I will moderate. There's a question for you. So can you open the chat back up for us? So a beautiful and powerful quotation. I'm not sure which quotation they were referring to. Perhaps the person who put that chat would let us know, yeah, which quotation you're referring to. And also, if you have questions, if you'll type them in the chat, we can indeed see them.
Hey, Trey, can you kind of speak to, I know that you worked at Shadows on Natasha, if you could talk about that a little bit, and then also talk about the things that have been hiding in plain sight and that experience.
Definitely. And so, for example, that's okay. And so I had the experience working at the Shadows as an intern for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And this original conversation about thinking about land use was first framed actually with their research that they've been compiling for a very long time about the section that was called or known today as the Weeks Land Holding or Weeks Family Land Holding, or Mary Conrad Weeks Moore's land holding that essentially was subdivided after her death in the 1860s. And there was references on how in which ways African Americans who were once enslaved on the Shadows property purchased land, would eventually purchase land in that land holding. So think about that relationship of the development of plantation complexes into how much ways African Americans were redefining their nature in connection to that land, and that they were forcibly labored on through the building of their own homes. And what did that mean? And so essentially that gradually transformed when I discovered or really relied on the Sanborn Fire Insurance Map Company because of what it was telling us. Though it's not a lens of residential development, I'm sad that it's not a lens of residential development, but how much ways commercial development. So that speaks about, yes, the ownership or private ownership of some families, but it also speaks about the everydayness of life happening in Liberia in relationship to life happening elsewhere. And so that quotidianness, that just essential everydayness of those lives definitely is rooted in that. And your other part of the question was?
But just, I remember us talking about the street names,
Exactly.
just the idea that what they referred to.
Exactly. And so really, the meta of it all is Hopkins Street. I mean, honestly, what does that mean, that relationship to Hopkins Street? And then reading that and having conversations with Dr. Hayes over the summer about how Hopkins Street is named after a plantation complex, Colorado Plantation, it's known as, but the relationship to that family who were enslavers. And thinking about that history of Hopkins Street into what it became in the 1940s and the 1950s, and that rapid transformation of that identification of place of the land that was used to grow sugarcane forcibly by enslaved Africans and African Americans into a space where they felt safety. They found themselves, they could be themselves in a main street, in a corridor that was not bound or restricted to what they were experiencing if they would go on Main Street or Highway 30.
Looks like we have some other questions.
Either way. You alluded to it a little bit in your conclusion, but I'd love to hear more about the difficulties that you faced in using some of these documents and what information may still be missing.
Yes, and so what's essentially the difficulties were, of course, thinking about how much ways these spaces could be identified, right? I'm relying on the Sanborn Fire Insurance Map, which in the early years did not include all of New Iberia, included a very small portion of New Iberia that they determined were needed to be saved, right, in case of a fire, which eventually would happen. But also thinking about other sources, right? I turned to the city directory that I came across upon. Luckily came across upon, finding one in the 1940s being published and seeing the secret color and saying this space has been identified, but recognizing that there was for example, a beauty salon who had no address. And so there was a disconnection of, I can't identify this space, but I still included in my writing component that yes, the space existed, but I do not know where this space existed. In addition, also relying on memory is a big deal, right? My connections at Iberia African American Social Society, working with the Little Brooklyn Neighborhood Initiative, how in which ways those spaces they remember or they were working with in their organization remember, and who to turn to ask questions if needed be. And of course, that's still an ongoing process of how in which ways we can identify those spaces and continue to identify those spaces. But how that connects to what I'm working on next is which of those spaces or what spaces are still there. I'm from St. Martinville, from Broussard. I actually get my hair cut in Iberia. And so I'm still in that relationship to traveling to Iberia, seeing those spaces. And I noticed along Hopkins Street many years, these old brick buildings, right? They're still there. Some of them are still there. And they look and seem as if they're dated back to that time period. But it would be amazing to say that, yes, they're actually still there, or these spaces are still there. How much ways those stories were built, ever more so details about those spaces.
Is there awesome presentation, Trey? Is there a parallel story about laws and policies that either explicitly regulate these racial space divisions, or of course a much wider sphere implicitly or indirectly regulated?
And so that is a great question, because it essentially was my first question that I asked, right? Thinking about, did New Iberia practice red line, right? And I still cannot say definitively yes, and still cannot say definitively no. Here in Lafayette, we know Lafayette practiced explicitly redlining. Even though it was overturned a year later, they still practiced and still essentially committed to that practice of saying that these areas are for African Americans and the rest of part of Lafayette is for whites. In regards to thinking about how much ways Iberia practiced it, it's not essentially outside of the reason that Iberia wouldn't practice it, but in regards of was it codified, it's still something that I'm asking. It's still something that I'm thinking through. We do know from conversations that there were subdivisions in Iberia that practiced restrictive covenants that were only for whites, or in that there were, particularly, for example, the Brooklyn neighborhood of Iberia, there were portions of it. I think about how its regulations it was built. It was built in relationship to a subdivision or the country club, and how much ways that relationship of the neighborhood was for a purpose of a domestic labor force, essentially, to supply what was happening at the subdivisions in the country club. And so that connection to domestic labor, Black women, Black men working in domestic labor capacities, and how much ways their position being so close to that country club, their relationship was. And so that's kind of informal, in some ways still formalized, right? Arguably formalized, but how much ways we can see that in other spaces. But it's also very important to note that the west end of New Iberia is still very much so a predominantly African-American space. The east end of New Iberia, there was portions of it that were still predominantly African-American spaces. But between this, right, that is kind of still the in-betweenness of mixed identities being an expression of African-American spaces, white spaces, and spaces in between new migrants and new participants in regards to the creation of that community, still very much so being influenced in those different spaces. And so that's kind of my relationship to it. Still not yet formalized. I can't say, yes, in 1950, New Iberia passed this law. I wish I could, because it would set a lot of examples and say, yes, this happened. But in regards of that relationship and space, it wasn't as clear cut as that yet. Okay.
So yeah, this was fantastic. So I have 3 questions. So the first one, and they're connected really. So I started with thinking, like, I thought, seeing the maps was great to see this. And then I thought, I was wondering, I thought you had created this. And I was wondering if you were working on creating like street level maps so we can better understand, so we could better see from a street level the space. And then this started, I started thinking about how Black spaces within New Iberia, there's such an expansion once you get to the 1940, 1960, and they're kind of all over the city. And as you point out, Little Brooklyn is this community, and it's on this other side of what is a natural barrier. And I started thinking about how this seems to, and I'm wondering if it represents that we can't really think about the African American community as a monolithic community, that there are divisions, right? And then I really started thinking about, I don't know if you read Catherine McKittrick's On Demonic Grounds, where she's critiquing the use of these maps that are official maps and how they in themselves represent settler colonial perspectives of space. But you can understand Black perspectives of space if you start looking at completely different sources. So I was wondering if you, and you know, she's looking specifically at narratives of people who were enslaved. That's one, you know, one example. So I was wondering if you are also looking at other sources to see where are Black spaces that may not be connected to this notion of ownership that might be on these.
Exactly. And so that's that root of it, right? Because emancipation is not a monolithic experience. Emancipation very much so runs the gamut of parts of who had access directly after emancipation or into emancipation to education, to land, to ownership of land, right? Even that idea of private ownership of land by African Americans directly after emancipation or into emancipation is something still to grasp through, right? To think through and process how much ways land was owned, but also thinking about how much ways these maps really do reveal a lot, right? Yes, they reveal a history of Black ownership of said spaces or Black communities or Black participation in those areas. It also reveals a crime, right? It very much so reveals that outline, that space, that forcibly nature of apartheid happening, right? And how much ways I found they were identified, right? The term Negro, the term colored, being used as a designation to racialize these spaces, not just simply in regards to thinking about Black geography today, but in regards of fire insurance, in regards of directors, in regards of thinking about how much ways those two relate to each other. It seems kind of abstract, but all in relationship to that system. That was very much so alive and well during that time. But additionally, how much ways to kind of wrap the other part to Dr. Richard's question was essentially the other sources really rely on memory, the memories of African Americans, communities in Liberia, Black communities in Liberia, because we do know that there are so many gaps within these years, right? We have a map in the 1930s, we have a map in the 1940s, we have two in the 50s. That's a very big variety. The only time period that predates that period, it's the early 1900s where there's 3. And so that's very erratic, very here, but also thinking about that relationship to what other spaces existed. There might have been a church that existed that wasn't included. I do know that there was a school that was going to be built. It was actually going to be called the Wakefield Institute, which is the Wakefield family library, very prominent African American family. Their story very much reveals that history as well. And it was going to be built and a tornado came and it knocked it down. And so that space, the resources are all there for it, but it never fully opened. And additionally, we're thinking about communities and spaces, private spaces, right? Your homes, right? Those spaces are not included in this map. Your kitchens, your living rooms, your dens, and the spaces are not included in this map. And we do know that essentially, those are those spaces that a lot of that community placemaking is happening, right? Parks are not included in this map because once again, that's thinking about that relationship to it. Other public spaces, you know, maybe it's an alley that was a space of community. That's not included. But especially, hopefully, as it continues to engage with other members of the community and other organizations, we can definitely identify those spaces, think about its relationship to those other spaces as well. So it was the excerpt from the article on Black geography's fantastic this project. And then that's Dr. Bruce from the University of South Carolina in Nova Scotia. But thank you, Dr. Bruce, and it's very much so that framing is essential to think through this project. Because without the framing, essentially, someone can say that, oh, you're just identifying these spaces, and what does this connection mean, right? It's easy to say that, as I said before, to look at this and say, oh, this is the African-American response or Black response to Jim Crow. We cannot limit that frame because of the fact that it is limiting a Black imagination, a Black spatialization, in regards of it just simply being a response to whiteness or being a response to that system. Rather, including it along with the idea of additional forms of placemaking, a specific form of Black placemaking in regards of geography and understanding the relation to the land, understanding the response and need and resources that was happening. And institutional spaces very much so goes the gamut of displaying values and relationships and communities and connections, and also access to transportation because of the nature of going, and which way in which we're connecting ourselves to.
Speaking of transportation, and you were talking about traveling to New Iberia. Were there places for travelers, for Black travelers to go to?
So yes, I didn't include them because they were private homes. But if you would look at the Negro Motorist Guide or the Green Book as it's called today, you will have spaces that identify. There are 3 tourist homes in New Iberia. And these were essentially private homes that were opened up for spaces for individuals to rest. They primarily were on the, on the side of the bayou with Main Street, with Hopkins Street, that area. But we also do know from oral histories on in Little Brooklyn, there were also tourist homes that weren't included in the Green Book, but spaces where individuals like Tina Turner and Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong stayed with families because of the fact that they couldn't stay in the white-only hotels. And the African-American community didn't, or at these times, in these spaces, I couldn't identify a Black hotel being established, a Black inn being established. But 1940s, 1950s, very much so when the Green Book was published in the 1940s, we've seen this kind of environment happening in Hopkins Street very early, but still happening into the 1950s, very much alive. Thank you.
Beautiful conversation. Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Trey? Either here or online. If you have a question, you can type it in or go ahead and turn your speaker on. We want to give everyone a chance. And if there are no other questions, oh, there is one more.
One more, Trey, what would you say to other undergraduates who maybe haven't done this kind of in-depth research? What would be your advice to them?
My advice would be that truly, number one, especially for my level or my area, what's the point of learning history? Right. And additionally, my frame is there's no research done in geography. You have to reach out to other individuals. You have to connect with individuals, especially something as very much so rooted in a community. You have to connect. I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Hayes, specifically diversity, but also with the shadows, and actually, and also being invited to conversation with or connecting with a Little Brooklyn Neighborhood Initiative. I also reached out to other organizations in Liberia that sadly couldn't reach me, but I'm still trying, of course, which ways they're also connecting. And so for me specifically, it's always about connecting and researching and connecting those two together. Because for this project specifically, like I said, it's very much so speaking about a community that is very much so alive and well, and very much so have their own inputs and have their own stories, and would love to share them, especially how their relationship worked too. In a very short story, over the weekend, well, over Thanksgiving, my grandfather and my grandfather's brother were together, and I had the ability to be in conversation with them. And they're from St. Martinville, but I was speaking about my work in Liberia. And that conversation sparked a conversation about their relationships in St. Martinville, and saying that you didn't have to go to Liberia to do that research. We had the same thing in St. Martinville. And they're like, well, it was smaller, of course, right? My grandmother joined in and said, yes, Hopkins Street, that was the space. But saying that St. Martinville, we had something small. It was our own, still smaller. We had a theater, we had cafes, we had spaces, we had little offices and stuff like that. But it was smaller, but it was our own. And additionally, they would point and laugh and think about Lafayette's relationship to that, right? The block in that area of, I'm going to say it wrong. Simcoe Street, yeah, I said it right. Simcoe Street, that area, right? The block. That was another space, very much so similar to Hopkins Street, though in another space, Lafayette being the hub city at that time, a little bit bigger, a little bit more extensive in some spaces, a lot more reflective. But once again, that urban population, that population of connection to city life, and how which ways going to Main Street or going to contemporary downtown wasn't always the option, right? Wasn't always inclusive. It was a space where they felt second-class citizenship, where second-class citizenship was not only felt, but very much so enforced, right? Where you can go into a space and not have to be called by your first name by someone younger. And going into those spaces and being called or being addressed as an individual, as a citizen, as a human, right? At basic level of humanity. And also, going to those spaces and hearing the gossip of the day in the community, and news, and et cetera, and updates. Not that those interactions couldn't happen in those spaces that centered whiteness or centered white identity. It was in these Black spaces, these spaces of Black geography, these individuals and community members could commune themselves in a space that was essentially, for lack of a better term, safe.
All right, well, we appreciate everyone's time. I thank Dr. Kelman for his question, because certainly, Trey, you are a wonderful example of what undergraduate research can be. And we are very, very glad that we could be part of you sharing this information with us today. And with that, we're going to end. We're going to stop sharing. If our technician will just click stop sharing and end our Zoom meeting. And for those people who were able to come, you please stay and have a cup of coffee if you would like. And thank you so much. One more round of applause. Very nice. And you can just end the meeting at the bottom. Thank you so much.